Here is a number, negative $1.26 billion. That is how much money the United States Postal Service lost in the first 3 months of fiscal year 2026. $1.25 billion in the red. That's the number that makes headlines. That's the number politicians point to when they talk about the post office as a dying institution bleeding taxpayer money. But here's another number, positive $350 million. That is how much money the United States Postal Service made in that same period, October, November, and December of 2025. Same institution, same employees, same trucks, same mail, same 3 months. Both of these numbers are real. Both are official. Both were published by the Postal Service itself in the same document. So which one is true? It's not a trick question, but it is a tricky situation because the answer isn't about stamps or email or Amazon packages. It's about a decision made in Washington more than 50 years ago, in the middle of a war nobody wanted to pay for, by a president who needed the books to look better than they were. What follows is the story of how the most important public institution in American history was handed a ledger that was designed, not by accident, not through mismanagement, not because the internet killed the letter, but by deliberate acts of Congress across 6 decades to make a profitable public service look like a money pit. We're going to go back to the beginning, not 2006, not 1970, the actual beginning, to the men who built this thing, what they intended it to do, and what it cost them to do it. Because once you understand what the post office was built to be, what was done to it makes a lot more sense. Information for democracy. In 1775, the Second Continental Congress made one of its first decisions as a governing body, not about the army, not about taxes, not about independence. They appointed a postmaster general. Benjamin Franklin took the job, and the choice was not ceremonial. The founders understood something that is easy to miss from this distance, that a nation is not made of territory, it's made of communication. And in 1775, communication meant mail. The Constitution, ratified in 1788, gave Congress the explicit power to establish post offices and post roads. It is one of the few specific operational mandates in the entire document. The founders put the post office in the same sentence as coining money and declaring war. The first major postal law came in 1792, and it revealed exactly what the founders thought this institution was for. The cost of letter postage was set between 6 to 25 cents, depending on distance. That was serious money at the time, but newspapers could travel through the mail for a penny and a half. This was not an oversight. James Madison and his colleagues built a deliberate cross-subsidy into the foundation of the Republic. Merchants and lawyers, who could afford it, paid high rates to send their letters. That money subsidized the delivery of newspapers, cheap, uncensored, traveling to every corner of the country, because an informed electorate was not a luxury. It was the precondition for everything else. There was no stamp, at least not yet. In the beginning, you didn't even pay when you sent a letter. The person receiving it paid when it arrived. The sender's credit was the system. It was inefficient, it was complicated, and it worked well enough for a young nation with 13 states and a few thousand miles of post roads. But the country didn't stay small, and the post office followed it west. Not because it was profitable to do so, but because that was the point. Every time a settlement pushed further into the interior, a post road followed. The network wasn't built where it made money. It was built where people were. And then, because there were post roads, more people came. There was one thing the system couldn't do yet. It couldn't come to your door. If you lived outside a city, on a farm in Ohio, in a river settlement in Kentucky, the post office could get a letter to the nearest town. Getting it from the town to your door, that was your problem. You wrote in when you could. You sent someone when you couldn't. And if weeks passed between trips, weeks passed between letters. The founders had the vision. They didn't yet have the infrastructure to complete it. That would take another 100 years. A department store magnate from Philadelphia, and a fight with some of the most powerful private monopolies in the country. John Wanamaker and Universal Service. John Wanamaker made his fortune selling things to people. Dry goods, clothing, furniture. He built one of the first true department stores in America, in Philadelphia, and then another in New York, and became one of the wealthiest men in the country. He understood logistics. He also understood customers. He understood what it meant to move things from one place to another at scale. In 1889, President Benjamin Harris appointed him Postmaster General. It was an unusual choice. Wanamaker was not a politician, and he looked at the post office the way he looked at a struggling store, not as a bureaucratic inheritance to be managed, but as a system to be fixed. And what he found offended him. The United States had a 2-tiered mail system. If you lived in a city, the post office came to your door. Free city delivery had existed since 1863. A New York merchant, a Boston lawyer, a Chicago banker, mail arrived at their address 6 days a week without any effort on their part. If you lived on a farm, however, and in 1889 more Americans lived on farms than anywhere else, you got nothing. You traveled to the nearest post towns, however far that was, whenever you could manage it. The information that Madison had designed the system to deliver, those newspapers and correspondence that were supposed to bind the nation together, sat in a wooden cubby at a general store miles away until someone had time to go get it. Wanamaker found this intolerable. He called it undemocratic. A farmer in Nebraska, he argued, was a citizen of exactly the same rank as a lawyer in Manhattan. The Republic had made a promise in 1792 and was only keeping half of it. He began pushing for rule-free delivery. This involved carriers who would ride out to the farms and homesteads and put the mail directly in people's hands. The opposition was immediate and fierce. Private express companies hated it because it threatened their hold on package delivery. Small town merchants hated it because if farmers didn't have to come to town for their mail, they might not come to town for anything else. The argument against rule delivery was dressed up in the language of fiscal responsibility, but underneath it was simpler than that. Powerful interests preferred a system that made rural Americans dependent on coming to them. Wanamaker didn't win the fight during his 4 years in office, but he did start the argument that eventually won it. In 1896, rule-free delivery began as an experiment. By 1902, it was permanent. By 1906, it reached nearly every rural household in the country. But that's not all Wanamaker wanted to do. Wanamaker wanted the post office to carry packages. At the time, that market was controlled entirely by 4 private express companies. When asked why the United States didn't have a parcel service like European countries, Wanamaker was direct about the answer. There were, he said, exactly 4 reasons, and he named those 4 companies. He didn't win that fight either, at least not in his lifetime. Parcel post didn't arrive until 1913, more than 2 decades after he left office. But when it did, it transformed rural America. The Sears Roebuck catalog, which had existed for years, suddenly became something farmers could actually use. A family in rural Kansas could order a set of tools or a coat and have it delivered to their door by the same carrier who brought their mail. Montgomery Ward followed. The rural economy cracked open. Wanamaker also put pneumatic tubes under city streets to shoot mail across town at high speeds. He put sorting rooms on ocean liners so transatlantic mail could be processed mid-crossing and be ready to distribute the moment the ship docked. He created the commemorative stamp. This was partly his art. He also understood that collectors would buy stamps they never used, generating revenue from collecting alone. He was a businessman running a public institution, and his definition of success was not profit, it was reach. In Wanamaker's framework, a route that lost money wasn't a failure. It was the price of the promise. The promise the founders had made in 1792, and the country was still trying to work out how to keep. By the time Wanamaker was done, the architecture of what we now call universal service was in place. Every address, every door, the same price, regardless of whether that door was on Fifth Avenue or at the end of a dirt road in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It had taken 100 years to build. It had never been intended to turn a profit. And for the next 60 years, nobody seriously suggested it should. LBJ and the Unified Budget. In January of 1968, Lyndon Johnson submitted his budget proposal to Congress. On its face, this was a routine act. Presidents had been submitting annual budget proposals since Warren Harding signed the Budget and Accounting Act in 1921. But this particular budget was different from every one that had come before. For the first time, it was presented as a unified budget. Johnson had appointed a commission the previous year, the President's Commission on Budget Concepts. It was meant to rationalize what had become a genuinely confusing system. At the time, the federal government maintained 3 separate and inconsistent ways of measuring its own finances, and budget debates regularly collapsed into arguments about which set of numbers to use. The same projected deficit for fiscal year 1968 could be reported as $2.1 billion, $4.3 billion, or $8.1 billion, depending on which accounting framework you chose. The Commission's central recommendation was straightforward, at least it seemed: consolidate everything into one number. But that seemingly reasonable solution had a real problem. It was also, in the context of January 1968, extraordinarily convenient. The federal deficit was real, it was large, and it was growing. What the unified budget did, by folding trust funds and self-sustaining programs into the single federal accounting picture, was make that deficit look smaller than it actually was. Social Security was running surpluses. The post office was generating revenue. Bringing those numbers onto the same ledger as defense spending and Great Society programs meant the combined picture was less alarming than the underlying reality. No law created the unified budget. No bill was passed. No vote was taken in Congress. A presidential commission made a recommendation in October of 1967, and Johnson adopted it in his January budget submission. The president's budget is an executive document, a proposal, a presentation. The format was his to choose. Congress received it, responded to it with individual appropriation bills the way they had always had, and had no independent mechanism to challenge the framing, because in January 1968, there was no Congressional Budget Office. There were no House or Senate budget committees. There was no institution on the legislative side capable of producing an alternative picture of the total federal budget. That capacity wouldn't exist until 1974. So the unified budget became the budget, not by law, by default. But that was a budget report. The real change came through law. In August of 1970, Nixon signed the Postal Reorganization Act. The Post Office Department became the United States Postal Service, an independent establishment of the executive branch, required to fund itself through postage and fees. Congressional appropriations would be phased out. The law was explicit. Federal budget laws did not apply to the Postal Service. But the unified budget tether was never cut. Nixon's own Office of Management and Budget moved the Postal Service off the unified budget administratively in 1974. That just so happened to be the same year Congress finally created the CBO and gave itself independent budget capacity. No law required the move. No law had required putting USPS on the unified budget in the first place. These were executive decisions made and unmade based on what was useful at the time. And useful is the operative word. When postal finances produced surpluses, including them in the unified budget made the federal deficit look smaller. When they produced deficits, excluding them made the federal deficit look smaller. The decision of whether to count postal finances in the national ledger was made not on principle, but on arithmetic. Depending on which way the numbers ran, the government then chose how to present it to best serve the narrative it was trying to create. The 1980s. Ronald Reagan came into office in January of 1981 with a simple proposition. The federal government was too big. It spent too much. And the way to fix the economy was to cut taxes and cut spending simultaneously. The math was contested then and remains contested now. What isn't in doubt is what it produced. The largest peacetime deficits in American history. Somebody had to pay for the gap between what the tax cuts cost and what the spending cuts saved. And David Stockman, Reagan's budget director, went looking for anything he could find. The Post Office Public Service Subsidy, the appropriation that had compensated USPS for the cost of universal service, for that rural delivery route, and the unprofitable addresses that no private carrier would touch, had been running at roughly 15% of total postal revenue. In 1982, they got rid of those subsidies. They zeroed them out. For the first time since 1792, the institution to go everywhere at the same price received no federal compensation for doing so. The universal service obligation remained. The funding for it did not. This was not accompanied by any change to what the United States Postal Service was required to do. The carrier still went to every address, 6 days a week. The cost of that obligation was now carried entirely by the people buying stamps. For a few years, it worked. The post office adapted, raised rates through the regulatory process, and by the mid-1980s was actually running surpluses. It had absorbed the loss of the subsidy and found its footing, and Congress noticed. In 1985, facing deficits, Congress pulled every administratively off-budget entity back onto the unified budget. That meant the post office. It was pulled back on. The effect was immediate and mechanical. Every dollar of postal service now offset the federal deficit. Every dollar of postal investment now added to it. The United States Postal Service was once again a number in the federal ledger, not because anything about its operations had changed, but because the government needed the surpluses to make its own books look better. Then came 1987. The Reagan administration, facing a budget gap it needed to close before the fiscal year ended, reached into the postal accounts for approximately $800 million. The justification was technical. Reimbursements, accounting adjustments, the language of bureaucratic appropriation. The reality was different. The post office had money. The federal government needed money. The money moved. Postmaster General Preston Tisch was furious. He launched a public campaign arguing that the United States Postal Service didn't use a penny of taxpayer money and shouldn't be subject to federal budget raids. The campaign worked well enough that by the end of the decade there was serious congressional momentum to move the Postal Service off the unified budget permanently, by statute. In December of 1989, that happened. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act gave the Postal Service statutory off-budget status for the first time. The Post Office had fought for years to sever the connection that Lyndon Johnson's unified budget had created, and it finally won. The price of winning was a new set of obligations, however. To get off the budget, the Postal Service agreed to absorb the cost of living adjustments for postal retirees, obligations the Treasury Department had previously covered, obligations that the Treasury Department covered for other agencies, and now the Post Office being singled out to cover it for itself. It was one of the first times, but not the last, that independence would be sold back to the Post Office at the cost of someone else's bill. Congress returned in 1990 with the next installment. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of that year made USPS responsible for the unfunded pension liabilities created by cost of living adjustments, payments that no other federal agency was required to make. Other agencies had their employer and pension contributions covered by congressional appropriations. The Postal Service had to cover its own, plus some new COLA obligations. All this from stamp revenue. This is where the pattern was first established, and you'll see it as we go forward into the future laws. Offer relief, attach a new burden. Let a year pass, maybe a few years, and then attach another obligation. By 1990, the Post Office had been off the federal budget for less than 12 months. It was already carrying costs that belonged to the Treasury, costs that no other agency had to pay. The bigger picture, Reagan's Washington. But to really understand what was happening to the post office in the 1980s, it helps to zoom out for a moment. Ronald Reagan came into office with a clear governing philosophy. Government was too big, it spent too much, and the private sector did most things better. That wasn't just rhetoric, he meant it operationally. At one point, he convened what became known as the Grace Commission, a group of business executives tasked with going through the federal government and identifying waste. The idea was straightforward. Bring in people who run things efficiently and have them tell us what's broken. In that environment, the notion that the post office should operate like a business wasn't a fringe position. It was practically the default assumption. So if you want to understand the larger forces shaping what happened to the Postal Service during this period, the political culture, the priorities, the way the people in charge actually thought about government and spending, there's no better window into that than Reagan himself. Not the speeches, not the retrospectives, the actual daily diary he kept by hand every single day of his presidency. I provide background on a book that provides that perspective, The Reagan Diaries, edited by historian Douglas Brinkley, and share some of my notes and perspectives on it on my other channel, Nonfiction Corner. The link is in the description. I release at least one new episode on a nonfiction book once a week, but most likely more than that. So check it out, and check back often. 2003, 2006, and the crisis on paper. In fiscal year 2000, the federal government recorded a surplus of $237 billion. By fiscal year 2003, the federal government recorded a total budget deficit of $374 billion. That was $216 billion more than the deficit recorded in 2002, and the largest deficit relative to the size of the economy since 1993. That swing from a $237 billion surplus to a $374 billion deficit in 3 years was driven by the 2001 tax cuts, a recession, and the onset of the war on terror. But a large portion of that actually came from one of those things, the tax cuts. Under the budget rules of the time, new spending had to be offset by savings elsewhere. Washington was looking for pockets of money that wouldn't require a tax increase or a cut to proper programs. That is the fiscal climate in which, on November 1st, 2002, the OPM director wrote to the Postmaster General to inform him that the post office's pension contributions were on track to overfund the system by $71 billion. I'll let you draw your conclusions about the timing of this. To fix this supposed overpayment problem, Congress passed the Postal Civil Service Retirement System Funding Reform Act of 2003. That was a lot. It lowered the Postal Service's annual pension contribution by $2.5 billion, and then locked every dollar of resulting savings in an escrow account that the Postal Service couldn't touch. The money was acknowledged as postal money. It simply wasn't available to the post office. That same law transferred the pension costs associated with military service credits for postal workers from the Treasury Department to the Postal Service. Every other federal agency had those costs covered by the Treasury. Only the post office would now pay for the military service time of its own employees. 3 years later, in December of 2006, a lame duck Congress passed the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act in the final days of the session. Section 802 of the law returned the military pension obligation to the Treasury, the one that had been transferred to the Postal Service 3 years earlier. Seemed like genuine relief. Just like the relief the post office felt when it finally got the COLA, the cost of living adjustments, moved off its books back in 1990. But it comes with a catch, just like 1990. In Section 803, it abolished the escrow account and redirected its balance, along with approximately $17 billion from the pension surplus, into a newly created Postal Service Retiree Health Benefits Fund, and then it attached a payment schedule, $5.4 to $5.8 billion per year, every year for 10 years, with ongoing actuarial payments continuing through 2056, pre-funding an obligation for the future at unprecedented scale for retiree health care benefits that wouldn't be claimed for decades, benefits for employees who in some cases hadn't even been hired yet. No other employer in the United States, not a Fortune 500 company, not a federal agency, not a state government, had ever been required to pre-fund retiree health care obligations in this way. The payment amounts were not calculated from what postal retirees would actually cost. Beginning in 2007, the Postal Service started reporting massive annual losses. Between 2007 and 2016, the total reached $62.4 billion. The Postal Service Inspector General calculated that $54.8 billion of that, 87 cents of every dollar, was attributed solely to the pre-funding mandate. Not because of the rise of the email or because of Amazon or mismanagement, but because of these artificial requirements. Then in April of 2016, the exigent surcharge that had been approved as emergency recession relief expired, taking nearly $2 billion in annual revenue with it overnight. In 2018, the Office of Management and Budget published a formal proposal to privatize the United States Postal Service. The justification rested heavily on those accumulated losses. The same losses that the Inspector General had already shown were almost entirely a product of the pre-funding mandate. The ledger that had been built to look a certain way was now being used to argue that the institution was unsalvageable. In 2022, Congress passed the Postal Service Reform Act. It wiped $57 billion of that accumulated unpaid pre-funding obligation from the books, producing on paper a $56 billion surplus. Headlines called it a fix, a landmark, the law that finally resolved the crisis. But buried in the legislation was a replacement mechanism. The Office of Personnel Management would now calculate an annual top-up payment each year, the difference between what postal retirees cost in health premiums and what the existing fund covers. The Office of Personnel Management, OPM, runs the numbers. OPM sends the invoice. In calendar year 2026, the post office has to pay $700 million for this top-up fund. But all this talking about losses brings us back to where we started, the GAAP loss, that negative number that we started with in this episode. It's all based on those obligations that no other agency has to pay for retirement benefits way off into the future. But there's another number that's reported, another number that actually is closer to the truth, that positive number that we also started with at the beginning of this episode. That number involves the actual operations of the Postal Service, the trucks running their routes, the carriers walking their rounds, the sorting machines processing the day's mail. Those generate a controllable profit of $350 million in that same quarter, while that GAAP number showed a loss of $1.26 billion. The founders built an institution to bind the nation together and inform citizens. For 178 years, it was funded as what it was, public infrastructure, serving a public purpose, with public money filling the gap between what stamps could cover and what the mission actually cost. Then the gap was closed, not by making the mission smaller, by making the accounting larger. And the number that results from that accounting, the scary one, the billion-dollar loss, is not a measure of failure. It is a measure of what was taken, a matter of interest. The entire interest problem begins with a word, overpayment. When OPM discovered in 2002 that the pension fund held more than the projections required, that surplus was immediately characterized as a mistake. Money contributed in excess of what was needed, an accounting error to be corrected. But if the post office is now being treated as an independent entity that's supposed to fund its own way, it's supposed to be more like a business, then that overpayment is not really a mistake. An independent business that builds reserves beyond its minimum obligation has not made an error. It has made a capital decision. The surplus was not an overpayment. It was a savings, and characterizing it as an overpayment was the preconditions for everything that followed. Because once the money was framed as a mistake rather than an asset, Congress could decide how to correct it in ways that had nothing to do with returning it to the post office. When OPM discovered the pension overpayment in 2002, the explanation was straightforward. The Postal Service's CSRS contributions had earned an interest rate much higher than the 5% assumed by OPM, resulting in that large surplus. That 5% assumption had been fixed in place since 1972 and never updated. The fund actually earned more than 5%, but the post office was paying amounts as if it was only making 5%. The difference supposedly compounded for 3 decades. The result was a surplus that, by the post office's own calculation, reached approximately $75 billion by 2009. That surplus was never returned. It sat in Treasury, with the Treasury Department getting interest off of that amount. The Treasury uses the money invested in these securities to help finance the costs of operating the federal government. This is not a side effect of the investment restriction. It seems to be the purpose. When the Postal Service deposits into the pension fund, it buys Treasury bonds. Treasury immediately uses that cash for general government operations. The Postal Service holds a bond, an IOU, that earns below market returns for as long as the law requires it to be held there. And the cost of that restriction is documented. The United States Postal Service built up billions of dollars in retirement reserves over years of payments. The federal government has held that money the entire time. When OPM discovered this excess of funds, Congress passed a law locking it in escrow, basically making it part of the federal budget. Instead of something exclusively controlled by the post office. When the escrow became politically inconvenient, Congress passed a law redirecting it into a new fund. When the new fund's payment schedule became impossible to meet, Congress passed a law forgiving the unpaid balance and replacing it with annual invoices. The money itself, the original overpayments, that earned surplus, has never moved. Only the paperwork explaining why it can't be returned to the Postal Service has changed. The 2 sets of books. To understand how the post office can report a loss and a profit for the exact same 3 months, you have to understand that there's actually 2 different ledgers. The first follows GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. This is the standard rule book for American business. Under GAAP, if a law says you owe a certain amount over the next several decades, you record that entire obligation on your books today. You don't wait for the bill to arrive. You don't wait to write the check. The liability exists, so it shows up right now. This is where that $1.26 billion quarterly loss comes from. It includes the retirement amortization payments, the pension accounting adjustments, workers' compensation calculations tied to interest rates, and the new annual top-up payment that OPM invoices every September. Most of these are obligations that extend decades into the future, calculated by actuaries using assumptions about the year 2050. None of them have anything to do with whether the trucks ran on time this morning. The second ledger is controllable income. This is what postal management actually controls. This is the revenue that came in from stamps and packages, minus the costs of running the operation, which includes carriers, fuel, facilities, sorting equipment, the actual machinery of delivering to 170 million addresses 6 days a week. So if you strip away the congressionally mandated retirement obligations, those obligations that management can't control or change or negotiate, you actually see a very different number. You see a surplus. Both numbers are official. Both appear in the same document that the post office presents. But the scary number, the one of the obligations that are imposed by Congress, those are the ones that are making the headlines. So now you know why there are two numbers. The only question now is, which one will people treat as real? Uneven regulations. On April 10, 2016, the price of a postage stamp dropped. For the first time in 97 years, a stamp got cheaper, 2 cents out the first class rate. Bulk mail rates dropped 4.3% across the board. The mailing industry celebrated. Consumer advocates called it a win. The post office lost nearly $2 billion in annual revenue, overnight, by regulatory order. Here's what happened. The Great Recession of 2008 and 2009 devastated mail volume. Businesses cut back. Bills went digital. Marketing campaigns went online. The volume losses exceeded $7 billion in a single year. The post office, already constrained by that 2006 law mentioned earlier, the PAEA price cap that limited increases to inflation, had no pricing flexibility to compensate. So in 2013, the Postal Service applied to its regulatory overseer, the Postal Regulatory Commission, for emergency relief. An exigent surcharge is what they called it. A temporary 4.3% price increase above the inflation cap. Basically, it was to increase the cost of stamps. This was specifically to recover recession losses. It was approved by that regulatory body. The surcharge went into effect January 2014, but that regulatory body attached a condition. That surcharge wasn't permanent. It would expire the moment the Postal Service collected a capped amount of $4.6 billion in surcharge revenue. The timer ran out on April 10, 2016. That additional revenue stopped, and the losses started. But let's go deeper and take a look at this surcharge. So who was paying for this surcharge? The answer is letter mail users. Ordinary people buying stamps. You and me, anybody. Nonprofits sending fundraiser appeals, magazines and newspapers. We were paying 4.3% more per piece. But the more interesting question is, who is not paying the surcharge? Amazon, UPS, FedEx, every e-commerce shipper dropping packages into the postal network. Every retailer using the post office's last mile delivery to reach addresses that private carriers wouldn't touch at a competitive price. Here's why. Under the PAEA, the same 2006 law that created the pre-funding mandate, postal products are divided into two legal categories. Market-dominant products are those where USPS holds a monopoly. First-class mail, marketing mail, periodicals. These face the surcharge. Competitive products are package delivery services. Parcel Select, Priority Mail, the products that Amazon and internet shippers use. These operate under different rules entirely. They were legally exempt from the surcharge. Let that sit in for a moment. Between 2014 and 2016, the package delivery side of the postal business was exploding. E-commerce was reshaping American retail. Amazon was growing at a pace that strained the postal network's vehicles, facilities, and workforce. The post office was buying new trucks, hiring new carriers, expanding Sunday delivery, almost entirely to accommodate the package surge. The infrastructure cost of that transformation was enormous, and the entire cost of recovering from the recession that preceded that transformation was being paid exclusively by the letter mail carriers, the people buying stamps. This is the structural trap the 2006 law built without anyone naming it out loud. The law required the post office to tax its monopoly products, the ones it controlled, the one in decline, to fund a recovery. It legally shielded the competitive products, the ones growing, the ones reshaping the cost base, from contributing to that same recovery. The shrinking side of the business paid. The growing side didn't. And when the shrinking side's payments ran out, when the $4.6 billion cap was hit, the growing side kept growing. Those packages kept adding costs, kept using the infrastructure, kept paying nothing toward the hole that had just opened up. But the benefits for those private carriers, for those companies shipping the vast number of packages, there's another aspect involved. It's called last mile delivery. Private carriers have always known that last mile delivery, the final leg from a local hub to an individual address, especially in rural areas, is the most expensive and least profitable part of logistics. It's why UPS and FedEx charge more for rural delivery, limit their networks, and partner with USPS to hand off the hardest addresses. The post office, by law, cannot decline. It goes everywhere, 6 days a week. Same price. The private carriers benefit enormously from this because if they did it themselves, the cost would be much higher than them just shipping it via the Postal Service. And they're the ones that were exempted from the surcharge. Modernization costs. The Delivering for America plan, launched in 2021 under Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, more than $40 billion in capital investment, new processing facilities, new delivery vehicles, new sorting equipment, a complete overhaul of the transportation network, and critically, a wholesale shift of the Postal Service's information technology infrastructure into the modern era, or at least that's what it was portrayed to be. For decades, the post office ran its own servers, owned its own hardware, employed its own IT support staff to maintain capitalized equipment that sat in postal facilities and depreciated slowly over time. Capital expenditures don't show up as operating losses. And not only that, you control all aspects of the system, the hardware, the software, the databases. When you buy a server, you capitalize the cost. It sits on the balance sheet as an asset and depreciates gradually, a little bit each year, spread across its useful life. It doesn't crater your income statement in the year you buy it. The accounting is slow and smooth. Cloud platforms, however, work differently. When you migrate from owned infrastructure to cloud-hosted services, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, whatever the vendor is, you stop buying assets and start paying rent. Every dollar you spend on cloud hosting shows up immediately as an operating expense. There's no capitalization, no slow depreciation, just a recurring annual bill that lands directly in your controllable expense column every single quarter. But there's a larger cost to this. You're actually taking out stuff that the post office owns, things it could touch, things it could control, and you're giving all that control to private industry. The data about what you're shipping, the data about who you're shipping to, the data about who you're writing to, all that is going to be sitting in servers, in clouds that are operated by private industry instead of something that is run by the Postal Service. And the cost of that physical infrastructure, of having your own computers, having your own servers, having your own network and software, when you're able to have that, you know the costs. They're built in. They're measurable. You can touch it. But if you move over to a service instead of infrastructure, you're then subject to whatever price swings that provider of those services wants to create. Who benefits from the ghost debt? So we've come full circle. We're at the two numbers we started with, negative $1.26 billion and positive $350 million. Same institution, same quarter, same trucks and carriers and sorting machines. One number is the one Congress requires the post office to lead with. The other is the one that describes what the business actually does. You've now seen where every dollar of that gap comes from. The retirement pre-funding mandate that no other employment has to meet, the military pension obligation that Treasury pays for every other federal agency but handed off to the post office, the emergency surcharge that a regulatory board removed overnight, taking nearly $2 billion in annual revenue with it, the cloud migration that converted invisible capital spending into visible quarterly expenses, and the 2022 reform that replaced one ghost with a smaller, quieter one that invoices every September. None of it was an accident. It was a ledger that makes a public right look like a private liability. So who benefits? Not the taxpayer. If the Postal Service fails, the taxpayer doesn't save money. They just lose a service. Postal workers don't benefit. 600,000 jobs, most of them union, most of them in communities that have no other major employer, most of them held by people who would have no comparable option if the institution disappeared. The small businesses won't benefit. They rely on a universal service network that goes everywhere, 6 days a week. That's the post office. Here's what does exist. A documented on-the-record proposal published in 2018 by the Office of Management and Budget, recommending the privatization of the United States Postal Service. The argument in that proposal leaned heavily on the financial losses, the unsustainable trajectory, they say. The same billions we just spent an entire episode taking apart. The post office is mostly self-funded. It is the only carrier legally required to go everywhere. The rural route that UPS declined, the mountain town that FedEx doesn't serve, the island community that no private logistics company would touch at a price anyone could afford. The internet didn't break the post office. We broke it with a ledger, with an accounting that no one else has to do. So now you know the math. And the first step to fixing it is understanding exactly how the math works, or in this case, how it doesn't.